Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at the official letter that had just changed everything. Her hands shook as she read the words again and again. The government was giving her family and the Morrison family just 60 days to solve their fight, or they would lose their land forever, 3 generations. That's how long her family had been fighting with the Morrisons over water. Her great-grandfather had started this mess, and now it was her problem to fix. The letter made it clear. If they couldn't work things out, the government would step in and take both ranches away. Eleanor walked to her window and looked out at the dry fields. Her sheep were suffering. The summer had been brutal, and without enough water. She was watching her animals get weaker every day. Just 5 miles away, David Morrison had all the water his cattle could ever need, but he wouldn't share a drop with her family. She remembered being a little girl, listening to her grandmother tell stories about the old days. Back then, her grandmother would say, when families fought too much, they would join together through marriage. It was the only way to stop the fighting and save everyone. Eleanor had always thought those stories were just fairy tales, but now, with everything falling apart around her, maybe those old ways weren't so crazy after all. Meanwhile, across town, David Morrison was having his own breakdown. He crushed the same government letter in his fist and threw it across his empty living room. At 32, he had inherited his family's cattle ranch and all the problems that came with it. His father had died 3 years ago, leaving him to handle everything alone. David walked out to his pasture and watched his prize bulls drinking from the stream that ran through his property. The water was clear and cold, coming down from the mountains. He had plenty of it, but he would rather die than share it with the family that had been his enemies since before he was born. But the government letter was serious. If he couldn't solve this fight, he would lose everything his family had built for over 100 years. The ranch house where his grandfather was born. The barn his father had built with his own hands. The land where for generations of Morrison men were buried. David had tried everything. He had offered to buy water rights from other neighbors. He had looked into drilling new wells. He had even talked to lawyers about fighting the government. Nothing worked. The only solution that made any sense was the one he hated most, working with the Vasquez family. That evening, Eleanor called her grandmother over for coffee. Maria Vasquez was 87 years old and had seen more changes than anyone else. In their small Colorado town, she had lived through wars, droughts, and family fights that had torn the community apart. Grandma, Eleanor said carefully, "Tell me again about those old stories. The ones about families joining together to stop fighting." Maria's eyes got bright. She had been waiting years for someone to ask about the old ways. In my grandmother's time, she said, when two families couldn't solve their problems, they would arrange a marriage. It would join the families together and end the fighting forever. Eleanor felt her heart skip. But Grandma, that's just old stories. People don't do that anymore. Maybe they should. Maria said quietly, "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. When everything else fails, you have to try something different." Eleanor spent the next 3 days thinking about her grandmother's words. She walked through her dying fields, watched her sheep struggle for water, and counted the money she was losing every day. Finally, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She called a lawyer and asked him to contact David Morrison with a proposal. The message was simple but shocking. Eleanor Vasquez wanted to marry David Morrison to end the family fight and save both ranches. David's reaction was explosive. "Maria Vasquez?" He shouted at the lawyer over the phone. "I would rather lose everything than tie myself to that family." But after he hung up the phone, David sat alone in his house and really thought about it. He walked through his empty rooms, looking at pictures of his parents and grandparents. He thought about all the Morrison men who had worked this land before him. Could he really let their legacy die because he was too proud to consider a crazy idea? The math was simple. If he married Eleanor Vasquez, their properties would legally become one. The water fight would end automatically. The government would be happy because the families had solved their problem. Both ranches would be saved. But Eleanor had made one thing very clear in her proposal. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. separate bedrooms, separate lives. She would save both families, but she wouldn't give up her dreams of finding real love someday. David stared at his reflection in his bathroom mirror. He was a good-looking man who had dated plenty of women in town, but he had never found anyone who understood ranch life, someone who could be a real partner. Now he was being offered a wife who would never be a real wife at all. The deadline was getting closer every day. David watched the calendar and watched his options disappear. Finally, on a hot Thursday afternoon, he called the lawyer back. "Tell Elena Vasquez I'll do it," he said. "But I want it clear that this is just business. Nothing more." When Elena got the message, she felt a strange mix of relief and terror. She had saved her family's ranch, but she had also just agreed to marry a man who hated her. A man she would have to live with but could never really be with. That night, she sat on her porch and looked up at the stars. Her grandmother came out and sat beside her. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked gently. Elena took a deep breath. "No, Grandma, I'm not sure about anything. But I know I can't let our family lose everything. If marrying David Morrison saves our land and his land too, then that's what I have to do." Maria patted her granddaughter's hand. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is something that scares you. Your great-grandfather would be proud." Elena hoped her great-grandfather would understand, because in just a few weeks, she would walk down the aisle to marry her family's enemy, knowing that their wedding night would be the beginning of the strangest arrangement anyone in their town had ever seen. The war between the families was about to end, but Elena and David had no idea that their own personal war was just beginning. The law office felt like a freezer. Elena sat on one side of the long table, her lawyer beside her, while David sat on the opposite side with his own attorney. Between them lay a stack of papers that would control every detail of their upcoming marriage. Elena had spent hours getting ready that morning. She chose her best navy blue dress, the one she wore to church on important holidays. She wanted to look respectable, like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. But now, sitting across from David, she felt like a little girl playing dress-up. David wore his father's old funeral suit. It was the only formal clothing he owned, and it still smelled faintly of mothballs. He kept his eyes on the papers in front of him, refusing to look directly at Elena. Every time the lawyers mentioned their marriage, he felt his jaw clench tighter. "Let's go through the main points," said Jonna Mills, Elena's lawyer. She was a no-nonsense woman who had handled difficult cases for 30 years. "This will be a legal marriage in every way, but with specific agreements about how you'll live together." David's lawyer, an older man named Robert Chen, opened the contract. "First, finances. All income and expenses will remain separate. Elena keeps her sheep operation profits. David keeps his cattle ranch income. Neither party can make major financial decisions without the other's written consent." Elena nodded. She had insisted on this part. She didn't want David thinking he could control her money or her business decisions just because. They would share his last name. Second, living arrangements. Jonna continued. "Elena will move into the Morrison ranch house, but will have her own private bedroom and bathroom. David will remain in the master bedroom. Common areas like the kitchen and living room will be shared, but both parties agree to respect each other's privacy." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The idea of Elena living in his family's house felt wrong. That house had belonged to Morrison men for generations. Now a Vasquez woman would be sleeping under his roof, cooking in his mother's kitchen, and probably changing everything to suit her own taste. Third, social expectations, Robert read. Both parties agreed to present themselves as a married couple. In public, this includes attending community events together, showing appropriate affection when others are watching, and avoiding any behavior that might suggest the marriage is anything other than genuine. Elena's stomach turned. The thought of pretending to love David, of holding his hand and smiling at him when people were watching, made her feel sick. But she knew they had no choice. If people suspected their marriage was fake, the whole plan would fall apart. Fourth, the annual review clause, Jonna explained. Every year on your wedding anniversary, You'll meet to discuss whether you want to continue the arrangement. Either party can request a divorce at that time, and the property will be divided fairly. This was Elena's escape plan. She didn't want to be trapped forever in a loveless marriage. If things became unbearable, she could get out and still keep half of what they had built together. David signed each page with angry, sharp strokes. His signature got messier as the contract went on, like he was stabbing the paper with his pen. Elena signed more carefully, reading every line twice before adding her name. When all the papers were signed, the lawyers shook hands and packed up their briefcases. Elena and David were left alone in the conference room for the first time since agreeing to this crazy plan. So, David said finally, still not looking at her, "When do you want to have this wedding?" Elena had been dreading this conversation. As soon as possible. The court wants to see that we've solved the problem. How about 3 weeks from Saturday? David laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. 3 weeks to plan a wedding. My mother. Plan hers for 8 months. This isn't that kind of wedding, Eleanor reminded him quietly. It's just a ceremony, just something to make it legal. But even as she said the words, Eleanor felt a pang of sadness every little girl dreams about. Her wedding day. She had imagined walking down the aisle to a man who loved her, wearing her mother's dress, surrounded by friends and family who were happy for her. Instead, she would be walking toward a man who saw her as his enemy, wearing a dress that had been stored in a closet for 20 years, surrounded by people who came to watch a spectacle. Planning the wedding was awkward for everyone involved. Elena's mother cried when she heard the news, though Elena wasn't sure if the tears were happy or sad. David's aunt, his only living relative, asked 100 questions that neither Elena nor David wanted to answer. The church was the biggest challenge. Pastor Rodriguez had baptized both Elena and David when they were babies. He had watched their families fight for decades. Now he was being asked to marry to people who clearly didn't love each other. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Elena during the required counseling session. Marriage is a sacred thing. It shouldn't be entered into lightly. Elena looked down at her hands. "Father, sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do to save the people we love. My family needs this. David's family needs this. Maybe God has a plan we don't understand yet." Pastor Rodriguez sighed. He had seen a lot of strange things in his 40 years of ministry, but this was definitely the strangest wedding he had ever been asked to perform. The dress fitting was the worst part for Elena. Her mother's wedding dress had been stored in tissue paper for decades. When they pulled it out, it smelled like old flowers and memories. The lace had yellowed slightly, and the style was completely different from modern wedding dresses. But it still fit Elena perfectly. "You look beautiful, Mija," her mother whispered. Tears streaming down her face, Elena stared at herself in the mirror and felt like she was looking at a stranger. The woman in the reflection was getting married, but she wasn't getting the fairy tale ending every bride deserves. Meanwhile, David was having his own struggles. He had to buy a new suit because his father's old one was too worn out for a wedding. Standing in the store, looking at himself in the fitting room mirror, he felt like he was preparing for his own funeral instead of his wedding day. The night before the ceremony, Elena couldn't sleep. She packed her belongings into boxes, knowing that tomorrow she would move into David's house and start a completely new life. She wondered what David was thinking in his own house across town. Was he regretting this decision? Was he planning to back out at the last minute? She didn't know. That David was lying awake too, staring at the ceiling and wondering what his parents would think about what he was doing. Would they be proud that he was saving the ranch? Or would they be disappointed that he was marrying someone he didn't love tomorrow? Elena Vasquez would become Elena Morrison tomorrow. Their family's century-old war would officially end. But both Elena and David knew that tomorrow was also the day their own personal battle would begin. The wedding was just the first step in an arrangement that neither of them truly understood yet. Elena woke up on her first morning as a married woman in the strangest bedroom she had ever seen. The guest room in David's house felt like a hotel room, clean but completely without personality. The walls were plain white, the furniture was basic, and there were no decorations except for a single landscape painting that looked like it came from a discount store. She could hear David moving around upstairs in what used to be his private space, but was now officially the master bedroom of their shared home. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate, like he was making sure she knew exactly where he was and that he was staying far away from her. The kitchen was worse. David had already made coffee and left, but not before washing his single cup and putting it away. The message was clear. He would take care of himself, and she could take care of herself. They were roommates, not husband and wife. Elena made her own coffee and sat at the kitchen table where a yellow sticky note waited for her. Feed truck coming Tuesday. Don't let them in the south pasture. It was signed with just A.D. Not David, not your husband, just D. This became their new normal. Communication through sticky notes left on the counter like messages between strangers sharing an apartment. Low on milk. Repairman fixed the fence. Don't use the red truck. Needs new tires. Never please or thank you or anything that suggested they were actually married. Elena quickly learned David's schedule and planned her day around avoiding him. She handled all the sheep business in the mornings when he was working with the cattle. She did her bookkeeping and office work in the afternoons when he was usually out fixing equipment or checking fences. They managed to share a house without actually sharing a life. But the hardest part wasn't living with David. It was pretending to be happy about it when other people were around. The first test came at Sunday church service, just 1 week after their wedding. Elena sat in the pew beside David, wearing her best dress and trying to look like a newlywed. When Pastor Rodriguez asked the congregation to pray for all the married couples, David awkwardly put his arm around Elena's shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, playing her part, but his touch felt like ice. After church, the whole congregation wanted to congratulate them and ask about their honeymoon plans. Elena and David had prepared for this, creating a simple story about being too busy with ranch work to take a trip right away, but standing there, accepting good wishes from people who had known them both since childhood. Elena felt like a complete fraud. "You do look so happy," said Mrs. Patterson, the church organist. "It's wonderful to see the families finally coming together." Elena smiled and squeezed David's hand. Hating every second of the performance, David managed to smile too, but Elena could feel the tension in his jaw as he forced himself to look pleased. The monthly Grange meeting was even worse. This was where all the local farmers and ranchers gathered to discuss community business. Elena had attended these meetings her whole adult life, but now she walked in as David's wife, and everyone stared. They sat together at one of the long tables, Elena hyper-aware of every movement David made beside her. When he reached for his coffee cup, she automatically moved her own cup out of the way. When she opened her notebook to take notes, he shifted slightly to give her more room. To everyone watching, they looked like a couple who had learned to move in harmony. The truth was they were just two people desperately trying not to touch each other. During the meeting, when the discussion turned to water rights and land usage, several people commented on how smart it had been for the Vasquez and Morrison families to join together. "You'd have figured out what your grandfathers never could," said Tom Bradley, whose own ranch bordered both properties. "Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one." Elena felt David stiffen beside her. She knew he hated being praised for something that felt like surrender to him at home. The tension was getting worse every day. Elena tried to make small improvements to make the house feel more comfortable, but every change seemed to annoy David. She bought fresh flowers for the living room and found them in the trash the next day. She replaced the worn-out kitchen curtains with something brighter and came home to find David had put the old ones back up. The breaking point came when Elena decided to reorganize the spice cabinet. She had noticed that David barely cooked anything more complicated than scrambled eggs, and the spices were old and disorganized. She spent an afternoon arranging everything alphabetically in throwaway containers that were years past their expiration dates. When David came in for dinner and saw what she had done, he exploded. "This is my house," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "These are my things. You don't get to throw away what belongs to me just because we signed some papers." Elena stared at him in shock. They were expired. Some of them were from 2018. I was trying to help. I don't want your help, David shot back. I don't want you changing things. I don't want you acting like this is your home when we both know you're only here because you had to be. The words hung in the air between them like a slap. Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Fine, she said quietly. I won't touch anything that belongs to you. I'll stay in my room and my office, and I'll pretend you don't exist. Is that what you want? David didn't answer. He just walked out of the kitchen, leaving Elena standing alone among the neatly organized spices that had caused such a problem. That night, Elena called her grandmother. I don't know if I can do this, Grandma. She whispered into the phone. He hates me being here. He hates everything about this arrangement. Mija, her grandmother said gently, you knew this wouldn't be easy. You're both angry and scared and trying to protect yourselves. But you're also both stubborn. Maybe too stubborn for your own good. What am I supposed to do? He won't even let me put flowers in the living room. Give him time, Maria advised. And give yourself time too. You've both lost something, your freedom, your plans, your dreams of marrying for love. You need time to grieve that before you could figure out what you might gain instead. Elena hung up the phone feeling slightly better but still completely lost across the house. She could hear David moving around in his room. She wondered if he was as miserable as she was, or if he was just counting the days until their first anniversary when they could end this arrangement and go back to their separate lives. What Elena didn't know was that David was lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the look on her face when he had yelled at her about the spices. He felt like a complete jerk, but he didn't know how to apologize without admitting that his anger wasn't really about spices or flowers or curtains. It was about the fact that having Elena in his house was changing him in ways he didn't understand and definitely didn't want. 3 months into their marriage, they had perfected the art of being polite strangers. But both Elena and David were starting to realize that pretending not to care about each other was becoming harder than they had expected. Summer brought changes that neither Elena nor David had expected. The ranch was doing better than it had in years. Elena's business sense combined with David's hands-on knowledge created something neither of them could have achieved alone. The sheep were healthier with proper water access, and the cattle were thriving with Elena's connections to better feed suppliers. At the monthly ranchers' meeting, their neighbors couldn't stop talking about the improvements. You to make quite a team, said old Pete Morrison, David's distant uncle. Haven't seen the place look this good since your daddy was alive. David felt a strange mix of pride and confusion. He had always been good at ranch work, but Eleanor brought skills he didn't have. She could look at numbers and see patterns he missed. She knew which suppliers offered the best deals and which buyers paid the highest prices. Together, they were making more money than either ranch had seen in a decade. Elena was discovering things about David too. He might be stubborn and angry, but he worked harder than anyone she had ever met. She would see him out in the fields before sunrise, fixing fences and checking on animals. He knew every cow by sight and could spot a sick sheep from 50 yards away. When a difficult birth required a veterinarian, David stayed up all night helping, never complaining about lost sleep. The first real crack in their wall of politeness came on a scorching July day, when David was repairing fence posts in the south pasture. The temperature was over 100 degrees, and he had been working since dawn. Elena was in her office, balancing the books, when she heard David's truck return much earlier than usual. She looked out the window and saw him stumbling toward the house, blood running down his left arm. A rusty fence wire had snapped back and caught him across the forearm, leaving a deep gash that was bleeding heavily. Elena didn't think. She just ran outside and caught David as he started to collapse from pain and heat exhaustion. His face was gray, and sweat poured down his forehead despite the blood loss. We need to get you to the hospital, she said, helping him toward her truck. Can you walk? I'm fine, David mumbled, but he leaned heavily against her as they made their way to the vehicle. Elena drove faster than she had ever driven in her life, one hand on the wheel and one holding a towel against David's arm to slow the bleeding. She talked to him the whole way, making sure he stayed conscious. "Tell me about the cattle," she said. "How many head do we have now?" 237, David answered weakly. "Why are you asking about cattle?" "Just keeping you awake," Elena said. "What about the feed order for next month at the hospital?" Elena surprised herself by how naturally she took charge. She knew David's social security number from their insurance paperwork. She knew he was allergic to penicillin because she had seen it on his medical forms. She knew his blood type from the ranch safety records she had organized. When the doctor asked how the accident happened, Elena explained about the fence repair and the heat. When he praised her quick thinking and applying pressure to the wound, Elena realized she had been genuinely scared of losing David, not because of their business arrangement, but because somewhere along the way, she had started caring about him. As a person, David needed 12 stitches and was told to take it easy for 2 weeks. Elena drove him home and helped him into the house, her hand on his good arm to steady him. "Thank you," David said quietly as she helped him sit down at the kitchen table. "I could have bled to death out there if you hadn't found me." Elena felt tears she hadn't expected. "Don't thank me for doing what anyone would do." "Not anyone," David said, looking at her directly for the first time in months. "My neighbor probably would have let me bleed. It was a joke, but it wasn't really a joke." They both knew that 6 months ago, before the arrangement, Elena might have driven past and injured Morrison without stopping. During David's recovery, Elena took over his ranch duties without being asked. She fed the cattle at dawn, checked water lines in the brutal midday heat, and fell into bed exhausted every night. The work was harder than anything she had ever done, but she refused to complain or ask for help. David watched from the kitchen window as Elena struggled with tasks that came easily to his larger frame and longer reach. She had to use a step ladder to check the water tank levels. She needed both hands to lift feed buckets that he could carry with one, but she never gave up, never asked him to do more than the doctor had approved. One evening, Elena came and covered in dust and sweat, her hair falling out of its ponytail and her clothes soaked through. She had spent the day repairing the same fence section where David had been injured, determined to finish the job properly. David looked up from the financial reports she had insisted he review. While recovering, Elena stood in the doorway like a tired warrior, and something shifted in his chest. This wasn't the cold, calculating woman who had proposed their business marriage. This was someone who would work until she dropped to protect what they had built together. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said quietly, closing the ledger book. Elena paused with her hand on the light switch for the first time. Since their wedding day, she met his eyes directly and didn't look away. "Neither do you," she replied. The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than either was ready to admit. They weren't just talking about ranch work anymore, and they both knew it. That night, David lay in bed thinking about the look on Elena's face when she had found him bleeding. There had been real fear there, real concern, and today, watching her work so hard to take care of his responsibilities, he had felt something he hadn't experienced in months, gratitude mixed with something deeper. Meanwhile, Elena sat in her room, finally allowing herself to think about what had happened. When she saw David hurt, her first thought hadn't been about their business arrangement or their legal agreement. Her first thought had been pure panic at the idea of losing him. When had that happened? When had David Morrison stopped being her enemy and started being someone she cared about? They were both too proud and too scared to talk about what was changing between them. But the wall they had built to keep each other out was developing cracks, and neither of them seemed interested in fixing it anymore. The ranch work continued to bring them together in small ways. Elena would find tools David had left for her to use. David would check on work Elena had done and quietly fix small problems without mentioning them. They were becoming partners in ways their contract had never planned for. Summer was ending, but something new was beginning between Elena and David. They just weren't ready to admit it yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, exactly 1 year after their wedding. Elena was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard the mail truck stop at their mailbox. She walked outside to get the mail, sorting through bills and advertisements until she found the official envelope from the county courthouse. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter from the court mediator's office, officially confirming that the Vasquez-Morrison land dispute had been permanently resolved. The federal intervention threat was lifted. Their marriage had served its legal purpose. The ranches were safe, the water rights were secure, and both families had kept their land. Eleanor read the letter twice, then walked to the barn where David was working on the tractor engine. Oil stained his hands and sweat marked his forehead despite the early morning coolness. "We did it," she said simply, holding out the official document. David wiped his hands on a rag before taking the letter. He read it slowly, his face showing no emotion. According to their prenuptial agreement, they could now file for an amicable divorce. The property would be divided fairly, and they could both return to their separate lives. It was exactly what they had planned from the beginning. But as David stood there in the barn where they had worked side by side for months, where Eleanor had learned to read weather signs and he had started trusting her judgment about business decisions, the idea of divorce felt strange. Not relieving, like he had expected, just strange. "So that's it then," he said, handing the letter back to her. "We're free." Eleanor nodded. But the word free didn't feel right either. Free from what? From the ranch that was thriving, from the partnership that had surprised them both, from each other. That evening, something changed in their routine. Instead of heating up a quick meal for herself, Eleanor cooked dinner for both of them. Not because she had to, not because they were pretending for anyone, but because it felt wrong to celebrate their success separately. They sat at the kitchen table where they had shared awkward breakfasts and late-night discussions about cattle, prices, and feed schedules. But tonight, the conversation wandered beyond business. David told Eleanor about his father's dreams for the ranch, about plans that had died when his father passed away too young. Eleanor shared her own hopes for expanding the sheep operation, ideas she had never talked about with anyone before. Neither mentioned the divorce papers sitting unsigned on the kitchen counter. Over the next few weeks, autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. Eleanor and David fell into a new routine that felt different from their careful avoidance of the past year. The pretense was gone. They were no longer performing for lawyers or neighbors or government officials. They were simply Eleanor and David, two people who had fought for the same land from opposite sides and somehow ended up fighting for it together. Eleanor still slept in her own room, but the walls between them felt less solid. When David had nightmares about losing the ranch, dreams that had haunted him since his father's death, Eleanor would hear him moving around the house at 3 in the morning. She started leaving warm milk and honey on the kitchen counter, the remedy her grandmother had always used for sleepless nights. David never mentioned the milk, but it was always gone in the morning. When Eleanor caught a cold that left her feeling weak and dizzy, she woke up to find that someone had fed her sheep and checked their water. David never said anything about it, but she knew it had been him. The town was starting to talk about them differently too. At church, people no longer watched them for signs of a fake marriage. Instead, they commented on how well the Morrison ranch was doing, how smart Eleanor and David had been to work together instead of apart. "You'd have figured out something special," Pastor Rodriguez told them after Sunday service. "It's not often you see a marriage that's also a true partnership." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his words. Partnership. That's what they had become, even though neither had planned it. The night of their first wedding anniversary, Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror for a long time. In her hands were the divorce papers that their lawyers had prepared months ago. All they needed were signatures, and their arrangement would be over. They could divide the ranch fairly and go back to being neighbors instead of husband and wife. But as Eleanor looked at her reflection, she realized she didn't want to go back. This past year had been the strangest of her life, but it had also been one of the best. She had learned things about herself she never knew. She was stronger than she had thought, smarter than she had believed, and capable of caring for someone even when that caring wasn't part of the plan. Eleanor took a deep breath, picked up the divorce papers, and walked upstairs to David's room. She knocked softly on his door, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it through the walls. David opened the door wearing just a t-shirt and jeans, his hair messy like he had been running his hands through it. When he saw Elena standing there in her nightgown, holding the divorce papers, his expression became unreadable. "I've been thinking," Elena said quietly, "this whole year. We've been so focused on what we lost when we got married. Our freedom, our plans, our dreams of marrying for love someday. But maybe we've been looking at it wrong." David didn't say anything, but he didn't close the door either. "Maybe some marriages are worth keeping," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe some partnerships are worth fighting for, even when they start for all the wrong reasons." David looked down at the papers in her hands. "What are you saying, Elena?" "I'm saying that somewhere in this past year, you stopped being my enemy. You stopped being just a business arrangement. And I think maybe I stopped being those things to you too." David reached out and took the divorce papers from her trembling hands. Without breaking eye contact, he tore them in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the floor between them. "Our marriage of convenience is over," he said softly, "but maybe our marriage of choice is just beginning, this time." When David leaned in to kiss her, Elena didn't turn away. She had spent a year learning that David Morrison was stubborn and proud and sometimes difficult. But she had also learned that he was loyal and hardworking and capable of change. She had learned that he made her laugh when she didn't expect it, and that he could be gentle when he thought no one was watching. As Elena kissed her husband, really kissed him for the first time, she realized that love didn't always start with fireworks and fairy tale romance. Sometimes it started with two people choosing to stay when they could leave. Sometimes it grew quietly, one shared mourning and one small kindness at a time. They had married to stop a war between their families, but in the end, they had discovered something neither had been looking for: a love worth fighting for, a partnership worth choosing, and a future worth building together. The war was over. Their real life together was just beginning.